Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Cup Duet Reviews. My name is Jillian Robinson. I am the Associate Artistic Producer here at Cup of Hemlock Theatre. And today I'm joined by the wonderful Ryan Borochovitz, one of our co-artistic producers. Ryan, are you feeling wonderful today? How are you feeling?
I suppose I am. Your word is as good as any on that regard. Yeah, how are you? Are you feeling wonderful?
Yeah, I am feeling wonderful at time of recording. Thank you for asking. And I am looking forward to unpacking so many wonderful attributes of the show that we're going to be talking about today. It is Dead Elephants. This is a show that is put on by Good Old Neon Theatre. They were at the Aki Studio from March 7th to the 17th. So this show we are releasing on the Cup post-run. So just kind of wanting to say right out the gate that it might just tailor and color the way that Ryan and I sort of talk and unpack our trunks as we move forward. Aha, see, I made a suitcase and an elephant joke there. So Dead Elephants, this is written by Alexander Offord, directed by Nicole Wilson, starring a cast of 3, Alan Cook, Hayden Finkelstein, and Nicole Wilson. So before we dive too far into our unpacking of the trunks, Ryan, what are you sipping with us today?
Okay, well, I'm just in my cup. I have coffee, nothing too exciting, but in the spirit of the elephant puns and humor and whatnot that you've already begun to unpack, I have it in one of my favorite mugs, one I actually don't use on the cup all that often, but it is from Over the Garden Wall. It says, "Ain't that just the way," with a teapot, because if people are wondering why is that to do with elephants, it is because the character Greg, who was wearing a teapot on his head for the entire series, we find out in the penultimate episode, spoiler alert for Over the Garden Wall, that it's a Halloween costume and he's been dressed as an elephant. So you can see the trunk there. So yeah, it's the most elephantine thing I own to drink beverages out of. So I chose it for this.
Nice.
Great explanation. How are you? What's in your cup?
Yeah, I love your donning your gray shirt too. A little bit of an ensemble there. Yes. I have a non-alcoholic beverage today, non-alcoholic but alcohol-esque beverage, I guess. So this is a Moscato Rosé, and I decided to kind of pour myself a little drink as one of our characters, Fred Thompson, is constantly offering to other characters and himself. So I'm going to be sipping on that today. And I also have some Hydration Station, as always, but especially because at time of recording, I have just completed doing 4 runs of a show myself. So apologies in advance if my brain is a bit squirrely. I'm also coming off the tail end of a head cold. And although we are kind of starting this episode chippy and throwing around the puns, this was a very heart-wrenching, emotional, heavy piece.
Yeah, we kind of buried the lead on that with all.
Yeah, we really did. I kind of want to just bring us, ground us a little bit more there. Ryan and I are recording this a couple days after we saw the production, so things have been percolating in us. I was quite emotionally racked, so that might bubble up today in our discussion as well. So, Ryan, why don't you take us down memory lane and give us a little bit of a synopsis of what this beautiful piece, Dead Elephants, was?
Okay, so Dead Elephants I'm trying to think of what the best way to describe it is, and it's a term I used to describe another piece that featured or was a brainchild of a lot of these similar artists fairly recently, and that is Frankenstein-esque, which was at the Toronto Fringe this past year, and we reviewed it then. Maybe that's showing up on the screen right now if you're watching this on YouTube. But a term that I used to describe that was a postmodern soup of sorts. And I would say that a similar vibe and aesthetic permeates this piece as well. So in the spirit of non-spoilers, because hopefully this will develop more of an afterlife beyond this initial run and be remounted elsewhere, I would say that the best way to describe this piece is that it is first and foremost a series of interconnected vignettes about the deaths of various elephants throughout history. And there's sort of 3 central elephants that make up that collage. The first and most prominent is the elephant Topsy, who was the star, if you can call her that, of the very first feature film, short film, but the film recording of a creature dying, because Thomas Edison captured the moment in which Topsy was executed by electricity in the infamous short film Electrocuting the Elephant. And that is, we will talk more about the specifics of what that film entails, I'm sure, as we go on, but that is kind of one of the central focus pieces of this show. That's the first elephant. Another one is the elephant Jumbo, who is killed on train tracks as part of P.T. Barnum's circus in St. Thomas, Ontario, it was. Am I remembering that correctly?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
And it's like several times throughout the show. Yes.
I know. I wanted to say Sault Ste. Marie, and I'm like, that's not right. St. Thomas, Ontario. And then the third elephant is one who I believe is unnamed, but a zoo elephant that is killed by French soldiers to use as sustenance during a prolonged military conflict. And so we kind of weave back and forth through these various scenes and interludes about these elephants throughout history, during which we are also weaving between scenes that don't at first seem to be about dead elephants, but it's about this married couple. Their names are Mark and Denise. And we learn pretty early on that they've been through something traumatic. I don't think it's a big spoiler to say that they have lost a child. That's something that is revealed pretty early on. Mm-hmm. But as their story gets weaved through the stories of these elephants, you start to think, okay, what is the connection? Your brain starts piecing things together about how this belongs in that. It's sort of the obvious outlier in this sequence of, as the program note said, this new genre of a theater of dead elephants that this piece could be the inaugural flagship exemplar of, but of which, as the program note says, there could be many more examples of. And yeah, I think as far as plot description goes, I maybe don't want to go any further than that for a non-spoiler, but it's a really interesting piece that brings all of these different historical interludes together, questioning ideas about life, death, our relationship to animals, what it means to be historically significant, et cetera, et cetera. And to say any more would maybe be giving up too much. Anything you want to add before we move away from that?
No, I think that's great, because as we kind of go beyond our spoiler shield, we can definitely pepper in even more of the sort of structure of the beast too. So I think we should leave synopsis there for now. So general appraisals, Brian, like how did you feel post seeing this show?
Yeah, so I thought this show was excellent. It was, so I've been following Alexander Offord's writing for quite a while now. I actually looked up how long ago the first piece of his that I'd ever seen was called Potosi, which was at the Toronto Fringe Festival in 2014 is what I looked up. So 10 years ago. And it was the winner of the new play contest in that year's Fringe and got a lot of hype there. Nicole Wilson was also a featured player in that one. And I guess cards on the table, Alexander was a student of mine in a class that I TA'd at the University of Toronto a number of years ago now. So we developed a bit of a personal rapport at that time, but it was kind of a little eyebrow raising for me at the time of like, what is he doing in this undergraduate course? This award-winning playwright whose work I highly admire. And he was a very good participant in that tutorial at the time. But so I've been aware of his work and following it for a little while now. And as I said, the Frankenstein-esque piece that was in the Toronto Fringe this past year is very similar. And I think I have a lot of similar feelings to this one as I did to that one, where I described it as very much my jam, but I could also understand if some people maybe don't feel the same way, or if it maybe isn't their jam in the same way. It asks a lot of its audience in terms of not just following the convoluted story and piecing together how these things make sense, but also, in this case, even more so than any of those other ones, it's very much, there is an extra emotional dimension that I think is very prominent here. Similar to Frankenstein-esque, this piece deals a lot with the life that we bring into this world as a theme that I think permeates through a lot of the work that these artists are clearly interested in making, which I think is interesting. And perhaps post-spoiler, we can unpack the implications of that a little more. But I thought this was truly excellent. It was very much a fun time until it wasn't, is perhaps the best way of describing it. And I think it wants to disarm its audience in that way to make you think that this is, we have our characters of 1 and 2 who sort of present this music hall, vaudeville sort of narrational framing device that oversees the piece. And there's like a lot of big, heavy emphasis on humor. But as the subject matter makes very clear, is that you maybe don't want to live in that humorous mindset for very long. Or if you indulge in it too much, as we did with our puns at the outset of this episode, then you might be setting yourself up for the wrong kind of experience here. How about you? What are your general appraisals?
Yeah, I think like right in the program note too, right, about good old neon theater. They create from an experimental ensemble driven process. And that's exactly what we saw. And I will sort of piggyback on what you said, Ryan. This is absolutely my jam of theatrical expression as well. But again, going back on what you're saying too, it might not be for everyone. This show, like, again, this has happened on the Cup with other pieces too, but I feel like this one has done basically encapsulated everything I've ever talked about on the Cup, of like talking from even like a theme perspective. Like, it unpacks death, life, time, love, relationship. A lot of the piece, this isn't quite spoilery, so I'm not worried about what I'm saying here, but a lot of the pieces, even just like two-handers and like kind of like intimate but absurd in a sense. I always find when we get two-hander scenes, and maybe this is even a post-pandemic feeling. It's always like, oh, right, what happens when you just have two characters on stage really digging into the nitty-gritty of life, of death, of space, of creatures? And I just find like all of those themes, and then paired with the use of the space, which we'll get into later in this discussion, but like the use of all of the set pieces and the props and everything was like imperfect, on the edge of my seat throughout, because as Ryan was saying, the piece sort of weaves through vignettes and you are following the same actors stepping into different characters. So your brain is trying to connect, because that's just what our brains do, point A to point B. And then kind of as you're going through this puzzle in your brain, you realize, oh, maybe it was a different connection. Like, you're constantly in on thinking through the piece. And that's exactly what the characters are doing too. Again, we'll get into it, but I was sobbing. I want to say, like, I was impacted throughout, but it was the back probably 30 minutes. I was an absolute mess because it really was pressing on my heartstrings. It's one of those things like you can feel the entire audience was having an experience, perhaps maybe not the same, but also kind of coming in and watching this as an artist. The true physical and emotional and mental feat that especially Nicole Wilson, I want to shout out. I mean, everyone is so, let's just shout them all out, because Alan Cook playing our pigeon, like the specificity and the, neuroses of a pigeon that he carried throughout.
I feel like we haven't even mentioned that there's a pigeon in it.
There is a pigeon.
One of our central players.
Yeah.
There's a pigeon. Don't let him drive the bus, but he is very much this kind of interesting, like all-knowing panto clown, I guess, MC type figure in this in many ways, although we also have other sort of panto MC type characters there.
Also, just like this all-knowing force that kind of helps with transitions, but then also, sinks us into the emotional transitions that we need, right? So, like, hats off to Alan Cook there. Hayden Finkelstein and Nicole Wilson play a plethora of characters, and each one have different accents. They have different, body postures and this fluidity of moving from one to the next. And again, we can talk about all of their characters possibly operating like a package. It's just like, holy moly, as a performer, like, doing this show even twice a day it's like the evolution of man, basically. I'm like, this, you're hitting every single sort of step of the way of a lifespan. And the entire team did it beautifully. I also, want to lift up Alexander Offord's text. I think a piece like this, like, right, it can get lost in translation. It can feel choppy and it can feel disconnected. And I think everyone will, like I said, find their connection to the piece. But just the way that, like, married to the choreography and the text, the text and the choreography, how they married, again, this like imperfectly perfect chapter of our sort of Mark and Denise characters' lives. which again, I don't want to get too far into it.
Should we just put the spoiler shield
Let's
up
just
already?
put the spoiler shield
right.
up. I think we're bursting at the seams.
Okay, before we do, if this run is completed, as we said, but if this is ever remounted anywhere, run out and go see this. Maybe you're watching this now, like in the future times, because it's about to be remounted. Stop watching here. We've maybe spoiled too much already, but rush out, see the show, and then come back to us.
Yes, indeed. And good old Neon Theater, please, please, please put these works on our stage. Like, continue doing your work, because I also feel like, again, this show is very different than like what Ryan and I have seen even in the 2024 season thus far. Has an element of absurdism. I also even felt an element of like European style theater. There's an element, again, Ryan said, like a postmodernist sort of feel. So again, a lot of companies are unpacking and placing this sort of these genres or flavors on stage. But I just think, if good old Neon Theater is all about that, please keep doing.
I can't say I've ever seen a show that belonged to the genre of theater of dead elephants before, which sounds like a theater of the absurd, theater of cruelty. And Alexander, if you're watching this, write a million other shows in this genre. I'll come see every single one of them. Do Hannibal Crossing the Alps. I'd watch that show, but I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
Make more elephant theater.
So our spoiler shield is going to be illuminating the screen right now. It is a light bulb, which I think now that we are in the circus ring, I'm going to talk about the space and the use of space first, because I love kind of, setting the stage, if you will, for our viewers and listeners. So again, this production was done at the Aki Studio, and how the orientation of the Aki Studio is set up was in their sort of like black boxy vibes. So the stage was essentially like a circus square. So it was thrust. There was audience on three sides, and the sort of border of our stage was a yellow and red, with the circus triangle borders with light bulbs all around. So a very cool ambience of, illuminating the onlookers kind of to start us off. And then inside of the square, our performers operated barefoot for the most part. And there were three main moving set pieces that sort of helped to indicate, which vignette we were roving between. So we had one that was a rectangle that had two haystacks, and that sort of represented our sort of the trampling of Jimmy from Topsy, the Alice Jimmy technician scenes. And then we had, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, can we just, before we even move on from the trampling, can we just talk about that trampling image, the way they created that? Because, whoa.
Yeah, I do want to talk about the next one, though, because the trampling happens via the next one.
Okay, apologies. Yes, you use the word trampling, and I'm like, I'm excited to talk about trampling.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, so yes, we will go back to that scene. So as kind of Ryan sped us on the tracks ahead there. So the other rectangle structure that Ryan was referring to there is sort of doubles as like a locomotive, but also as Fred Thompson's office. He was the manager of Coney Island, or like...
Yeah, either the manager or the owner. He was the boss man there who was initiating Topsy's execution.
Yeah, so it had like, an old-timey desk and chair with some drink of choice in a nice old-fashioned brandy bottle, if you will. So that... like I said, doubled that locomotive and an office space. And then our third rectangle installment was this sort of like orange, looked like a slice out of a nursery or just a like bedroom of sorts, with a rocking chair and some like rocks, crystals sort of downstage.
Trinkets of some kind. I didn't get a good look at what they actually were shaped as. I don't know if you did.
I think they were stones. Like when Nicole picked one up, it looked, I didn't get full on look, but it seemed like like stones or crystals or anyways. So again, these three structures were sort of positioned at one of the square's vertices throughout, and just like impeccable transitions and roving between all of these vignettes. Alan, Hayden, Nicole, our performers, sort of make those movements. And obviously there's additions of props, like our 1 and 2 sort of vaudeville hosts at the top had like sparkly sequins blazers. When, Nicole transfers into Fred Thompson, she puts on suspenders. when she's Alice, she takes the suspenders off and she has a little bow headband. So a lot of like Brechtian sort of character indicator. Here's a prop. You're someone different. Here's a costume piece. You're someone different. We can get into the costumes later, but I kind of just wanted to. And then there was also a screen at the back that is utilized at the end of the piece. The use of the gobos were fantastic. There was sort of like a caged gobo light fixture that resembled Topsy's sort of cage. Okay, yeah, so I guess I brought us back to Topsy. So Ryan, you want to talk about how our locomotive, one of our movements of these big set pieces. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's not even that I have much to say about it. It was just because you were bringing up the way that it was used, that in one of our opening scenes when the carny named Jimmy is trying to impress his date Alice by getting the elephant to move, Topsy the elephant. He lights, I don't remember if it was a cigarette or a cigar, but to wake her up. And this is historically what did happen with Topsy. And, she gets up and tramples him. And the way that's staged in here is by rolling one of those big carts or whatever that you were just describing. Is carts the best word? I don't know.
Sure, carts, rectangles.
Yeah, rectangle. You said Brecht, and now I'm thinking Mother Courage, but whatever. But yeah, having rolling over, and there was this kind of like very precise cutout at the bottom of it so that he could be lying on the ground and it just went right over. And I think it was amazing for like a lot of ways, just like such a perfectly violent image that evokes violence without actually creating any. We never have a sense of genuine danger for the actor here, but it is because we can see how the mechanism works. But it's one of our earliest scenes, and it really sets the tone of the abstractness of the violence that we're going to be presented with throughout this piece. I think it's also very interesting that, and this is clearly a deliberate choice, that no elephants are ever staged in the piece. Nobody ever becomes an elephant or embodies one in any meaningful way. The closest we get to seeing an elephant, when we do see an elephant, is at the very end. We're post spoilers now. When we do get the elephant, the actual original electrocuting an elephant film projected onto that back screen, although tastefully cut prior to the actual execution of Topsy. So nobody has to watch an elephant actually die in this piece. But I just think like using that rectangular cart to evoke this destruction. And also, as you kind of reminded me specifically, that it was the cart that represents Fred Thompson's office, which already connects us to the circus environment, but not the hay bales that we would think would be more naturally belonging in Topsy's environment. Because I would say, perhaps I'm reading into it a little too much, but maybe there's some kind of connection here between like the violence being inflicted by this money grubbing
by modernity
or this capitalist showman who wants to make a big scene, a big splash, get people talking in the papers, pay their 10 cents to see something spectacular, that it's his office that is initiating this violence, which I think is really interesting. Sorry, if you want to add anything, please.
So I think I want to, because this piece it's set up in vignettes, and also like you don't really necessarily get what's going on or like feel what's going on until the end. I think I want to sort of talk about my journey with the piece. Yeah. I think it also will help listeners or viewers sort of get a semblance of chronology-ish of what this piece was. Again, this is a recording that Ryan and I will do like as an episode length, but we could talk days and days and days about this piece. We will definitely be thinking about it for days and days and days and months and years. Okay. So this is kind of what I got out of it, from it. And again, it's going to be hard to articulate in words, because this is also a piece I kind of shared with Ryan that as like an artist, a female artist, sometimes we see shows, or I see shows where there is such a deep, visceral, emotional connection that unpacking sort of like, what did you think of the show, seems very like surface layer. It sometimes seems like invasive of like, it's not that I don't want to talk about it, but it's like, I was so impacted. It's how do I even put into words what sort of ride my soul and heart went on? But I'm going to share as best as I can. So Mark and Denise, as Ryan kind of mapped out, to me, those are our main characters, at least for my journey. And I would say also for the piece too. But so they're a couple who have lost a baby, and they're also So Hayden plays Mark and Nicole plays Denise. And Hayden and Nicole are like two-handers throughout. So it's halfway through the piece that, again, we get vignettes about Denise and Mark, about Jimmy and Alice. When Jimmy gets trampled by Topsy, Hayden then plays technician, who is responsible for electrocuting Topsy. So Alice and the technician have some scenes together. And then the French soldiers that take down the elephant for sustenance. Hayden is Alain, Nicole is Henri. So there's all of these two-handers that are dealing with literal historical, like dead elephant situations, but they are embodied by the actors playing Mark and Denise. And each of these two-handers there is a connection in a relationship, whether it be intimate, whether it be through camaraderie, whether it be through circumstance, whether it be through marriage, also whether it be through businessmen. So to me, it was halfway through the piece that we start hearing more about how Denise is really not moving on from the loss of their daughter. And Mark is really trying to connect with Denise and try to get Denise some help, try to have a conversation. And there's this constant friction between Mark and Denise. And Denise is perseverating. And sort of, you were saying, yes, Ryan, there are no elephants sort of used or mostly embodied in this. But as the piece clicks along, Denise is definitely, she's stomping. She's, accentuating her chest to look kind of like big elephant sort of presence. She's slowly sort of showing outwardly this electrocution of an elephant. And it was halfway through the piece to me that I was like, oh my gosh, two things are happening or might be happening, right? It's what does it mean when we, talk about all of these historical elephant moments while also unpacking this sort of couple that can't connect. And at the end of the piece, you find out like their daughter's room was wallpapered with elephants. We're in spoiler zone now. Their daughter was electrocuted. They hung a bird light above the crib and woke up to find the light had fallen and electrocuted their daughter. We find at the end that Denise is watching this video of an elephant being electrocuted. So things connect us. But something that was like, I started seeing, and a lot of this was through Hayden's performance as we clicked along the piece. He was sort of falling out of character when we were in the French soldier scenes, when we were in the technician, electrocution scenes, when we were in the businessman scenes. And Denise was spiraling more, was becoming more elephantine or becoming more agitated and becoming more uncontrollable. And it was in those moments that I was like, oh my God, is this also them trying to connect or make sense or reconnect as a couple? Like, is this some sort of like, we can't necessarily talk about it, but we can sort of role play to find what we need from each other or what we want of each other. And it's okay to express what you need to express through Henri or through the technician. Or so it's like we get these snapshots of historical figures unpacking these like moments, but then at the same time, there's almost like a light gel or a fill of this is also, to me, it was like, this could also just be Denise and Mark trying to connect. And again, I think this is where we get into the realm of like postmodernism as well, because there's multiple layers of sort of theater and life happening at the same time. And again, what my journey and exposure was, some people might not feel that, or take that experience or go that far into that. Like they might think, oh no, those vignettes are the vignettes. And then it just so happens they're colliding with Mark and Denise. Whereas I'm like, oh, well, maybe they are Mark and Denise. But yeah, and then it's that final monologue that Nicole does as Denise, where she's sitting on the rocking chair and literally looking at the audience and breaking the fourth wall, because prior to this, the pigeon, played by Alan Cook, which again, I'll kind of sew into my experience, he was constantly, having these philosophical chunks of text of unpacking like a pigeon's life, the specificity of that, and contrasting and comparing it to human life, and literally coming up close to the audience and looking audience members in the eyes through his pigeon mask. And so he sort of primed the audience that there is this break of the fourth wall. And I love that was primed for us, because when Nicole was Denise at the end and she was in that sort of liminal space of theater and fourth wall and telling us about the elephant wallpaper and the electrocution of their daughter and how her trauma, because I'm on display, I should be feeling a certain way. Again, it was just this multi-layered, beautiful beast that I feel like I'm trying my best to use every word in the world to describe my experience. But yeah, that's kind of just where my brain and heart and soul kind of like lived, like piecing things together. One last thing before I lob it your way. Again, because the piece was sort of constantly in motion and flipping between vignettes, there is a final scene that Mark and Denise share at a dinner together. They're just like, Mark makes Denise some pasta and salad, and they're just sitting down and having a meal together that ends up, turning into a conversation that is unable to be had, a conversation that is awkward, a conversation that is packed with two sides of the coin not understanding. There's flipping of food. It's basically every conversation that everyone has had at some point in their life, either with their loved one or with a parent or with themselves. And the length of that scene, again, I want to tip my hat to Alexander Offord, because I think the pace of the piece was pretty like clicking along, like a train clicks along on a track, taking us from scene to scene, taking us in and out, but then making us sit at that dinner table with Mark and Denise. And like the length of that scene was noticeably for me different than everything else. And that just really got into the emotional caverns that were already overflowing in me. But that's when I started like audibly sobbing. So that's just like a definite form compliment I want to give to Alexander, and also Nicole in the direction of the pace in that. Wow, I've talked so much. What was your experience like, Ryan? Or what do you want to,
it feels pretty
go in?
redundant for me to like walk through my own experience, because a lot of it was very similar to you. I think something that hearing you map all that out, I think this piece does a very good job of, I'm trying to think how to quite articulate this, because on one hand, it never really lets you live in the confusion, I guess is maybe, and a part of me actually, I don't know if I think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's just a neutral statement about this show, that I think part of me thinks it maybe wants us to be a little more confused, or a little why this, why now. But I also think maybe the inclusion of the characters of 1 and 2 are vaudeville clowns with their sequin blazers. They maybe hold the audience's hand through what they're experiencing a little more by presenting it as if this is just a collage of these things you're going to see, and you'll have to just, experience them as they come and make meaning wherever you find it. And so I think with that, it's also a minor critique that I kind of had of Frankenstein-esque as well, which again involved many of the same creatives, is that like there was a similar sort of opening framing device there, where they really wanted to make sure that the audience was aware that this isn't a straightforward, faithful adaptation of Frankenstein. We're doing something kind of postmodern with this. And I part of me feels like maybe we could trim some of that out, and maybe that would allow us to live in a confusion so we could have more impact when we finally allow ourselves to realize what's happening. But like, and I don't think that's certainly not like a major, like a complaint or anything. It is just, this is a very clever show. And when I see things like that, it makes me feel like it's worried that it's too clever for its audience. And I think the audience can handle being confused for a moment with something like this. But then I think, to follow your journey with what you're describing, is the dinner scene is interesting as a pivotal moment in there because it's not controversial to say that Mark and Denise are the protagonists of this piece, that a lot of it is filtered through their perspective, whether you go as far as you've said about that it's them reenacting all of these historical interludes, or if it's just that by having the same actors portray them, that it's evoking these connections, or maybe all of them are happening in Denise's mind specifically, is I think an equally valid interpretation. She's the one who's watching the original Electrocuting the Elephant movie, so it makes sense that she would be the one imagining the circumstances that led to it and maybe thinking about other elephants and other kinds of untimely deaths in this way. But the dinner scene, I think why I latch onto that, similar to I think why you did, is because from that moment on, we don't have any more of the historical scenes. We just live in this present tense with these characters. We have this quite prolonged, awkward and uncomfortable and frustrating and like painfully tragic encounter between these two people who are probably, even if the play doesn't end how it does, and we can talk about that in a moment, but like they're probably never going to reconcile. We can see that in there. And then the aftermath of that bringing us back to that final monologue that Nicole gives as Denise, that also in a way explains everything. Like, I don't think there is quite any stone unturned where you're like, oh, I still don't understand. Like, you really do, like, it sinks in, and it sinks in so impactfully when you do get that information. But it's also like, all right, we've had our fun, but this is what you've been watching this whole time. And like, a part of me also feels similar to what I said about the 1 and 2 sequences. Maybe there's a little over explaining, but I can't fault it for the way that it's so like it hits you and then leads into the final moment. So there can be no ambiguity about what's happening there.
Yeah.
And of course, Nicole sells the hell out of that monologue. Like, geez, Louise.
Yeah.
Sorry, do you want to chime in?
I just will say the one thing that was kind of not, no pun intended, brought to light until that final monologue is this light fixture that is hanging downstage right. And to me, I didn't even, at first I was like, oh, that's just like a hanging light. And you do notice it in some of the scenes, especially in like the businessmen scenes. Hayden's character, Haynes, like walks a lot around the light and is not really interacting with it. It's just there. It's just existing. So to me, that was also, I was like, oh, is this just kind of, again, adding a little theatrical spark of flavor? Just like, is this a ghost light? Is this like, again, just like an emblem of theater that's just existing in this thing called a stage, on this thing called a stage? And then it's the monologue that Nicole gives at the end, in which she explains that we hung this bird light to sort of be this mobile for our baby. And like, everybody in the audience is like, and that's the light. That's just constantly hanging in this space, in this cage, in this ring that, very much, I want to pick on what you said too, Ryan. Like, it's very much Denise's journey and Denise's psyche, regardless of how you kind of want to unpack all of the vignettes. Like, even in all of the two-handers, she is sort of the more superior, higher status character. Like, her trying to make sense, and Mark's or Hayden's character sort of, offering suggestions or responding or cowering, like sort of very much the lower status of the two, even though there's definitely boiling moments where they come head to head. Do you agree with what I'm saying?
Sorry. Well, yeah, I'm just also remembering I think it's the last moment we spend with Fred Thompson and Haynes.
Yes.
Where that power dynamic completely shifts, where Haynes has always been the more demure, I just want to make sure the animal is executed humanely. And then at the end, when Fred Thompson is backing away from what he's thinking, he's had a come to Jesus moment with it. Suddenly Haynes, who is like the director representative from the ASPCA, is like, we will electrocute this elephant because modernity is just. And like, oh my God, the chills of him taking that. I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt your thought process here with that.
No, it's okay. And I also think that happens after we get like a solo scene of Mark in therapy. And it's after, that's like the one scene that kind of stood out. I don't want to say like a sore eye as in a bad thing, but it definitely stood out because it was like, oh my gosh, what does it mean like Mark being alone? And it was him in therapy. And then I did notice, like this shift of power of helming the space post that Mark therapy session. So I think like you're saying, Ryan, like even that scene of Haynes and Fred and that switch of status, I think again, that's one of the last scenes we see before we get to this dinner scene where it's Mark saying like, I can't do this anymore. You know, so okay, Alexander, just like keep writing things, please. This is just great. Anyways, I want to go back to the light. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
But again, we see this light that's just been hanging in the space. And the final image of Nicole takes a bucket, pours water in it, and stands directly underneath this light bulb, which we now know to be faulty, and puts her hand on it and is electrocuted. And then the lights go down and we actually see a clip of Topsy kind of being guided, like the actual historical clip of Topsy being guided to her electrocution. Yeah, this is, I kind of want to go back and just kind of take us a little bit more practical. And I know I mentioned like there's a pop of prop and a pop of costume to sort of indicate everything, like so perfect. Absolutely, like perfectly, impeccably done. I just thought everything made exact sense. Like this was a piece that I was like, I know exactly who is talking, who is what. The execution and helping of putting on costumes by the cast was very fluid and strong. Yeah, it just kind of added, I feel like this piece, again, deserves to be imperfectly perfect and messy at times, but the fact that there was such precision and execution of like costume and prop usage, it just added like this, put on like a bow to a perfect theatrical piece in my mind. Yeah. Do you have any other sort of technical shout outs?
The lighting design, because you talked a bit about that. You mentioned the gobos, but two things that I want to just shout out very quickly about the lighting design. One, you mentioned that there was the light bulbs all the way around, which evoke this circus atmosphere, but also the fact that the circus is lit by Edison's newfangled electric lighting is very much, it's not just that this evokes circuses, this is situating us historically in this very specific circus. And why I shouted out as a lighting design element in addition to just a set design element is because the way that certain bulbs went out during the technician scene, kind of walking back and forth, sort of like a goldfish kind of going back and forth between the bulb to like replace one, and then, there's another. And it also kind of just evokes how much wattage this Coney Island institution is using just to light the place. And then when we had to talk about the 6,000 watts or whatever are going to be used to execute Topsy, it's really emphasizing a sense of just gross consumption and energy usage. And, the thrust of modernity is this thing that is wearing itself out right before our eyes, that it's just come into existence and it's already not able to sustain itself. I think like the lights going out that way was just a brilliant touch in that regard. And the other just very brief lighting design element I do want to shout out is in that early scene where Jimmy lights his match to get Topsy awake, and just, I don't even know how they did it lighting design wise, but just like the flash of something that evoked the striking of a match. I don't think I'd ever seen that in the theater before. And like, yeah, that was amazing. Connor Price Kelleher, apologies if we're mispronouncing everybody's name. But yes, just shout out to you. Some amazing flourishes and touches there that I think, did a great job.
Yeah, I think, again, we've talked a lot about like through the lens of Denise and Mark and how this might be like a piece of a couple wading through trauma individually and as a pair, but also to kind of piggyback on what you just said, Ryan, like this is also an environmental sort of protest piece. And also like PETA should come see this piece because they really do pay homage to these elephants and also like treatment of pigeon. Like, again,
I wonder,
this feels like 5 different plays in one. And then on top of that, each vignette is like its own little micro play.
I do wonder what PETA would think about the kind of character assassination of Mr. Haynes, as I know PETA and the ASPCA are different organizations, and I actually don't know what they think about each other. I'm not that well read on this, but it is kind of interesting that the sort of environmentalist character who's advocating for the animals in a very Loraxian sort of sense is the one who kind of has the last word on, we will initiate this cruel and unusual execution.
Right.
I don't know, it's interesting. And yeah, I'm sure, yeah, as the program note specified, that there is no attempt for this to be historically accurate. So I certainly won't fault it for, I don't know if Mr. Haynes's grandchildren would appreciate this portrayal, but all of these people were, on the cusp of something interesting historically and not necessarily and following through with the best ethics or morals of how they were handling this interesting pivotal juncture of history.
Again, Alexander, please keep writing these masterpiece package plays.
This is sort of like a weird, idiosyncratic, quirky thing that I'll mention, but I'll mention it anyway, is literally days before seeing this show, I was reading a book on the bus that mentioned what the show is exactly about. It was specifically brought up the film Electrocuting the Elephant, in which Topsy is executed. Now, I'll bring this up because it's going to sound strange and roundabout in a certain way, but I was reading this book. It's by Jacqueline Goldsby. It's called A Spectacular Secret, Lynching in American Life and Literature. It's a weird book to be reading on public transit. I try to cover. I've been reading a lot of books about the history of lynching lately because I'm writing a dissertation chapter on the play Appropriate by Brandon Jacobs Jenkins and doing cursory research on the history of lynching for that. But Topsy the Elephant made an appearance in this book about the history of lynching, and a couple things that I thought were interesting. Again, I knew that the play was going to be about this history, so that's why when I got to that passage in this book, I was like, oh, well, I'm going to see a play about this in a couple days. But the thesis of this book is essentially that we tend to associate lynching as something that is retrograde, pre-modern, a backwoods mentality. But part of the argument in the book that Goldsby makes is that the culture of lynching is a product of modernity. And like that goes down to some of the ways that, telephone poles and new technology at the time was often used as the apparatus or the gallows for achieving that. And the fact that photography itself has been so heavily weaved into not just the history of how we remember lynching or how lynching is preserved, but also specifically the ways that the events themselves were framed with the camera in mind, understanding how that was part of the ritual of itself. So it's a very interesting, insightful analysis about the entanglements of modernity and the history of lynching. And in part of that analysis, she mentions this film, Electrocuting the Elephant, that the very first, as this play kind of discusses, this first instance of an animal or any living being dying on film, as far as we know, is something that was supposed to be a hanging, first of all, that Topsy herself, the play does get into this, but she was supposed to be hung. The play, I don't think, gets into this specific reason that at least this book mentions up, is that it was just a logistical issue of how you hang something so heavy as an elephant that it couldn't be done with the rigging technology that they had at the time. So then first they tried the poison carrots, which was mentioned in the play, and then ultimately the electrocution was the way to see it through. And of course, the electrocution itself is this, perfect encapsulation of the modernity being used as a new means of ending a life. And the fact that it was put on film, which was itself a new technology, was very much entwined with that. And something that struck me reading this, again, leading up to the play, not even knowing that the play was going to be about this element specifically, but the importance of names in this play is very interesting. And that is a through line throughout here, that what we do or do not give a name to is very thematically charged. This comes up with Mark and Denise in the sense of perhaps if we hadn't given our child a name, then it wouldn't feel the same way. It would seem less individuated, less human in this way, and our grief would instantiate itself differently in that regard. And Denise actively rejects that mentality, that the fact that the baby was named doesn't or shouldn't make a difference. But then that thread goes throughout all of the pieces about which elephants do or don't have names and how that changes the way we grieve them or how we enter them into the historical record. And we tend to personify or anthropomorphize them by virtue of the fact that it is imbued with personhood through the proper name. this rigid designator in a linguistic sense. And Topsy is an interesting name, as I don't know if I would have thought of this unprompted by this book, and it never comes up in the show itself. The show is very invested in the fact that Topsy has a name, Topsy, and as a result, we think about Topsy differently because of that. But Topsy's an interesting name because it's, and like I know this because I've read the book, the book I'm about to mention, Uncle Tom's Cabin, features a young black girl character named Topsy who has been turned into a bit of a stock figure in many ways of an unruly black child who gets tamed, for lack of a better word, in that particular novel and all of its various theatrical and film instantiations thereafter. But the idea of thinking of it through the prism of lynching, and I know I'm only bringing that in because I happen to have this in my mind and thinking it through there, but there is an interestingly racialized element to the way we think about this execution and preserving that execution through modern technologies. And to me, it's not enough that the elephant has a name, but I think there's meaning that could be read into what that name signifies and how we think about life and the disposability of life in relation to some names differently than we do with others. That not, yes, having a name humanizes this elephant, but it's also a name that has been used as a mechanism of dehumanization for a lot of people and characters throughout history, which, yeah, sorry, I'm rambling about this a lot. Anything you want to say about anything you want to say about the proper names, whether Topsy specifically or just that element of the show?
Not even the proper names. I think I want to go back to you, like, bringing up, the lynching. Also, the fact that, that Topsy was initially supposed to be hung. But I think what we haven't really mentioned straight out right is, like, the idea of executing Topsy, regardless of what way they wanted to do it, it was supposed to be a spectacle. Like, also, Fred Thompson was like, this is going to be like an installment of the circus, basically. You get to see an elephant electrocuted. There it is. Exactly. And lynchings were spectacles as well. And as you learn, if you did catch appropriate a coal mine, or even just know this historically, of like lynchings, some folks got to take souvenirs home. Like, this whole idea of like traumatic spectacle. And I also think like that's what this play is doing as well. Like, it's using theater, it's using performance to work through or present trauma. So I just, thank you for bringing that up, because again, I think, we're adding more layers of how the idea of like spectacle was presented in this piece, and how it's being performed on our stages around Toronto, of like, what is traumatic spectacle and how do we present it? We honor it by presenting it and unpacking it. Yeah, sorry, that was just kind of like a footnote, or like to your.
No, I'm glad you brought that up. And like for those who are listening to this with the podcast and didn't see me pointing at the title of this book, again, it's A Spectacular Secret, and it is very much about this, photography and film created spectacle of something that was already theatricalized, but gave it a broader distribution in this way, and circulated it beyond the people who were present for the actual in the moment spectacle, and disembodied it in many ways that desensitized it. And I think now that you're actually, sorry, do you want to jump on that?
No, it's okay. I just have like another example of spectacle on our stage.
Please do, because I think what I'm about to say might link into that as well.
I just think, again, like going back to Nicole's monologue, like where she's literally confronting the audience of like, I'm supposed to be breaking down right now, or like, you're supposed to be watching me spiral. And again, it's forcing the audience to be, to question, what did you come here to see? What do you want out of this trauma? What do you want out of the spectacle? And it reminds me of Fairview that we caught at Can Stage a while back as well, which again, as that piece spirals out, very much so, it's like the black body being put on display. And it's through that final monologue sequence again, too, where again, the audience is asked and confronted of, how does this make you feel? Where do you stand on this?
Literally, where do you stand in that case?
Because you're invited into the play space if you would like, or you stay in your seat. It's this direct line of confrontation and conversation that the performer places in the audience laps. And again, I think that breaking of the fourth wall, it's nothing new. Pieces are doing that all the time. But I think when you marry that sort of like theatrical form break with the themes and the multi-layeredness that we're talking about, again, I don't bring this up often, but I think, and maybe we should be bringing this up more on the Cup, but just like audiences can handle a lot of stuff. It's very interesting, especially post-pandemic. I think we are slowly seeing more and more companies be unafraid to put pieces on stages that are confronting and in direct conversation with audiences. Yeah. And I think it also invigorates me as a theater artist myself, because I think, for years and years, it's been like, oh, theater is a dying art form. And it's like, no, theater can do this. What we're talking about right now. And yeah, it'll tap into you viscerally and physically in a way that a screen will not do. You wanted to kind of pivot us.
I think I wasn't even going to pivot. I was going to just kind of dissect the way that it's interesting that spectacle is presented as one of the prisms through which Denise is specifically processing the trauma, which is very much a private affair. And then I'm glad you brought up in the final monologue, she questions the audience's capacity to themselves resist turning their private, intimate family crisis into a spectacle. And I think the play is very much inviting us to question this. It's, it makes no bones about the fact that it is very disapproving of the spectacle of executing Topsy. And yet part of me also kind of wonders, who's the one who is making a spectacle out of the loss of Mark's and Denise's baby? Well, it's them, and it's by extension, it's good old Neon, it's Alexander, it's Nicole. They're the ones who, like, and again, I don't think these are real people, these characters. They're very much fictionalized, but it's interesting to think about this as a play that's asking us to resist indulging in the spectacle while itself creating a spectacle, turning into the elephant before our eyes, and presenting us with the film that, like, again, there's so much insightful material in this program note. You'll see I highlighted parts of it here because I thought it was very clever. Like, and I alluded to this earlier, but, the reason that Topsy has been picked out of history as being in some way special or important is not to reproduce the violence which the film represents. In other words, to not make a spectacle again out of the spectacle of her death. And like, I'm sitting in the audience reading this and I'm like, somebody's read Sadia Hartman, but I think there's something interesting about the way that this play confronts us with this history that we would not usually be inclined to think about. It's such an obscure little nugget of 3 or 4 or so on little minutia moments of history that certainly aren't minute in the sense that literal elephants die, but death happens all the time. Pigeons die all the time, as the show never tires of reminding us, and that there is this transcendence that relates to the animal's death of becoming something else as the play presents. But I also think that it's interesting the way that the play is so invested in opening these wounds while constantly being gun shy about the ethics of doing so, when literally nobody made them do it. They are clearly invested in bringing this up. Mark and Denise are invested in interrogating all of this as it relates to their own trauma. And yeah, I don't know what I think about it, but I'm going to be thinking about it constantly. I guess is how I will cap off that rambly thought there.
I think we've been thinking about it on every neuron in our brain is firing, this and that and this
with
and
electrons.
that. Hey, yeah. Can I share like a quirky thing that happened in my experience too? So as I said, Alan Cook, who plays Pigeon in this and is kind of vital of, helping with transitions and like making sure Hayden and Nicole are kind of prepped for the next thing, but then also stitching in philosophical absurdist monologues as this, again, impeccably physiqued pigeon. And part of Alan's performance, and then this is again in Nicole's direction of really having him like pick out individual audience members and have one-on-ones with. There was a moment where the pigeon was talking about how a pigeon's senses are heightened. And like, I keep, and saying like how I can smell everyone in this room, or I know things about you that no one else does, or whatever. And one of the moments was, I can tell that you're ovulating. And that moment was tossed right to me. And again, maybe too much information, but I indeed was ovulating. So
and
I was
he
like,
could tell.
this is just like, again, that I was chuckling in my seat because I was like, okay, this is just like honest theater magic. I'm like, how did you know that like I'm the one, person in the audience you decided to pick out? And yes, I indeed was ovulating, pigeon. So again, there's this sort of, I think, again, we are going all over the map here, but I do kind of want to talk about the pigeon because I also think just like the costuming of the pigeon was impeccable. To me, like the pigeon, it was kind of dressed like the Doctor of Death, like back in like Plague days, like how Alan's costume was, this sort of like, like grade blue, like trench coat sort of
kind
vibe.
Like Benedictine monk sort
of. Yeah, like scarf action going on. And then like the cap of the pigeon was like skin tight around his face. Again, I got like the Plague Doctor vibes. And in this character who is talking about life and death and has this sort of like quirky Tim Burton-y sort of like approach to how he's saying things. And then, so yeah, to like actually pick out people in the audience and like spit truths that I'm like, oh my goodness. And really illuminating like a pigeon's, eyesight is, I don't remember the exact fact, but like extremely wide in comparison to humans, and their senses are on fire. And the fact that, they're young, they're only with their young for 25 days. And like some of their young don't survive and then they just eat them. Like there was like this, it was almost like the pigeon was offering a moment of like, I wasn't taken out of the piece, but a moment I was like, oh, this is going to be like a fun, like brevity, like in between these heavy historical moments. And I'm like, oh no, this is like, it's not a moment of brevity, it's a moment of heavy, and it's kind of getting that thing in the back of my mind that's been primed by the two-hander, and now it's brought to the forefront. Like, I just didn't know a pigeon could make me feel all those.
Can I just say, we are currently in Toronto right now living through the golden age of anthropomorphic narrator figures. Like the pigeon, to me, he evoked Peter Fernandez's tree in the master plan at Crows. He evoked Stephen Howe's titular cockroach and Cockroach at Tarragon last year. All of the dogs and 15 dogs. Like this is a great time to be watching anthropomorphic animals on Toronto stages. And what a great addition to that group. And they're all so different. And this pigeon is like nothing we've seen in any of those other ones.
Again, we are firing on all cylinders right now. Glad that this is coming out post-run too, because as I kind of said at the top of this episode, Ryan and I were able to kind of have like a charcuterie board discussion going in and out of like physical, emotional, and thematical moments of the piece.
It's also so interesting. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
Just apologies if this conversation is a bit like a postmodernist soup.
Well, it's funny to me because we're recording this just a couple days after attending opening night, and this won't come out until after. But it's not like we've read other people's reviews. As far as I know, none have even come out yet at the time of recording. So we're like belatedly reigniting the discourse of the show without actually engaging in what the discourse became of this show while it was on the stage. So Alexander, Nicole, the whole company, I hope you enjoyed whatever this was, but we enjoyed your show, and this is the product of that enjoyment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually, it's kind of interesting you brought that up, Brian, because like we are recording this on the same field as like other reviews or social media discourse. But this episode is coming out several weeks from, or about a week from the run. So it's like our future thoughts. Will they be,
I wonder if anyone else in their reviews is going to talk about how we're in the golden age of anthropomorphic narrators right now. Hey. Well, maybe that wasn't the most original thought and I'll seem lazy for even bringing it up, but I brought it up before I read others bring it up. Or if they don't
Nice.
bring it up, then I did it first, I guess.
There it
Oh,
is.
this is crazy.
Okay.
What an interesting show.
Yeah, what a great show. A lot of light bulb moments. We are going
Hey.
to dim the lights on this review. But again, just to reiterate, good old Neon, Alexander Offord, Nicole Wilson, and all of your team members, please, 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 please keep doing these works. Look at this beautiful mosaic discussion about theater and so much more. But yes, as words are kind of slowly becoming those like magnet word things that you can make on people's fridges, we are going to conclude this episode. We look forward to maybe Dead Elephants will have another life down the road. But if not, we do look forward to tuning into more good old Neon productions. So on that note, Ryan, where can people find and follow you?
Well, no need to find and follow me personally, because I'm not overly active on social media, but if you like me and my theater thoughts, they live on the Cup. That's the show you're watching right now. It's at COH Theater on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, not calling it the other thing. We've had our fun. And it's Cup of Hemlock Theater on YouTube, where you might be watching this, Cup of Hemlock Theater podcast, and all the podcast places where you might be listening to this with your elephantine ears. That may or may not help you fly. Ain't that just the way? How about you? Where can people find and follow you?
People can find and follow me at my artist Instagram account, Jillian.Robinson96. And speaking of animals, at time of release of this episode, I would have just finished my last sort of juncture of Pin the Explorer, which was a puppet show that I have done throughout this past year for kids and families, and where I got the opportunity to play a bunch of different animals. And I actually learned a lot from that experience. And yeah, we need to listen to the animals, people. I will also have more projects coming up down the line. So keep your eyes peeled to my social pages if you want to keep up with me there. And thank you as always, Ryan, for doing my duty as host by plugging the cup. We love having these post-show discussions. Again, Ryan and I would be talking about this anyways, and to be able to do this on a platform for y'all and kind of crack open and discover and discuss, this is really fun. We love what we do.
We
So
love
on that
theater.
note, we do. I'm going to take the rest of my here drink and do one last cheers. Get on out there, see all of the theater friends, stay healthy, stay well, and yeah, spring is upon us. So get on out there, spring into action. Woot, woot. Cheers, everyone. See you next time on the Cup.
Cheers.